So, while there are lots of similarities between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, there are also some key differences. Now, when we talk about the American Revolution, we're talking about the period between 1775 and 1783, when the 13 North American colonies of the Kingdom of Great Britain in the New World revolted against their mother country and won their independence with the help of France and Spain. They created a new nation, the United States of America. When we talk about the French Revolution, we're talking about this period between 1789 and 1799, when the people of France overthrew their Bourbon monarchy, established a republic, and then set up one of the first modern dictatorships in Europe. The American Revolution began because of growing tensions between the Kingdom of Great Britain and its 13 colonies across the Atlantic. These were British subjects who had become increasingly discontent with British rule. The colonists felt that the king and parliament in Britain didn't have their best interests at heart. The king and parliament enacted a series of acts and taxes that the colonists felt infringed upon their liberties and rights as British subjects. The so-called Intolerable Acts, for example, punished the Massachusetts colony for the Boston Tea Party by closing down its port until the tea companies were reimbursed. And so the colonists argued back, saying, "No taxation without representation." How can we be taxed by a parliament in which we have no voice? Because they had no voice in parliament. The colonists felt they had no choice but to revolt against the government and declare themselves the independent United States of America. In France, the situation was very different. There was no faraway mother country to whom they were tied and whose rule they were rebelling against. And while there was discontent among the French population regarding their king and his court, it wasn't nearly as bad as in the colonies. The French people did not want independence. They wanted reform. They wanted to change the way their government worked and make it more representative of the people. Another major difference between the two revolutions is the role that ideology played. In America, Enlightenment ideas like natural rights, popular sovereignty, separation of powers, and republicanism inspired the revolutionaries. In France, these same Enlightenment ideals would inspire the Jacobins, who would later take control of the revolution and execute the king. Lastly, another major difference between the two revolutions is that the American Revolution was primarily fought between 1775 and 1783, while the French Revolution would rage on from 1789 all the way through 1799, although most of the major action would happen between 1789 and 1794. That being said, let's look at three surprising similarities between the two revolutions. The first similarity is that both revolutions were prefaced by a storming of a symbolic structure. In America, it was the destruction of the Boston Tea Party which saw colonists disguise themselves as Native Americans, march onto merchant ships owned by the British East India Company, and dump 92,000 pounds of tea into the Boston Harbor in protest against the Tea Act of 1773. In France, it was the storming of the Bastille, which happened on July 14, 1789, when an angry mob of Parisians descended upon the medieval fortress that had served as a prison for political dissidents. Both events were turning points in their respective revolutions, acts of defiance that demonstrated the growing discontent among the populace and served as catalysts for open rebellion. The second similarity is that both revolutions featured a period of constitutional convention in which representatives from across the land met together to draft a constitution for their new nation. In America, it was the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which saw delegates from the newly independent states meet together in Philadelphia to draft a new governing document. In France, it was the National Constituent Assembly, which started out as the Estates General, a representative body composed of members from the clergy, nobility, and commoners. When it became clear that the delegates from the Third Estate or commoners were not going to get what they wanted from the king, they broke away and formed their own National Constituent Assembly and drafted the Constitution of 1791, which established France as a constitutional monarchy. the third and final similarity is that both constitutions established a representative government with three branches that were independent of the monarch. In America, the Constitution of 1787 established a republican government with three branches: the executive, led by the president, the legislative branch, led by Congress, and the judicial branch, led by the Supreme Court. In France, the Constitution of 1791 established a constitutional monarchy with a similar division of power between the branches of government. However, the French Constitution left the king as the head of the executive branch and monarch of the nation. So, why does this count as a similarity? Well, when we compare the two constitutions, it becomes clear that the writers of the French Constitution were heavily influenced by their counterparts in America. In fact, the French Constitution is essentially a copy of the American Constitution with a few minor differences. Both establish a representative government with three co-equal branches that are independent of the monarch. Both establish a system of checks and balances in which each branch has certain powers over the others. Both establish a system of federalism in which power is divided between a central government and regional governments. And both establish a Bill of Rights to protect the basic liberties of the people. Now, obviously, there are some differences. Like I said, the French Constitution left the king as the head of the executive branch, but given the circumstances, this was actually a pretty good outcome. You see, at the time that the French Constitution was drafted, Louis XVI still held out hope that he could avoid a full-blown revolution by making some concessions to the revolutionaries. By establishing a constitutional monarchy, the French revolutionaries showed the king that they were willing to compromise and work within the existing political system. But at the same time, they also made it clear that the king's power was no longer absolute, and that he would have to share power with an elected legislature. This was a significant concession on the part of the revolutionaries, and it allowed the king to save face and maintain the legitimacy of the monarchy. Ultimately, however, the king would prove to be unwilling to fully embrace constitutionalism and share power with the representatives of the people. Instead, he would attempt to flee the country and undo the revolution. This ultimately failed and resulted in the execution of the king and the establishment of a republic. Now, if you've watched my videos on either of these revolutions before, you know that the French Revolution would go through a radicalization process during which the Jacobins would take control and execute the king, Queen Marie Antoinette, and many members of the French nobility. They would then establish a republic and institute the Reign of Terror, in which thousands upon thousands of suspected enemies of the revolution were executed by guillotine. Then, Napoleon Bonaparte would come along and overthrow the revolution and establish the First French Empire. In hindsight, it seems pretty obvious that the French Revolution was much more radical than the American Revolution. But at the time, it didn't seem this way at all. You see, in the late 1780s and early 1790s, there was a growing sense of optimism in France and across Europe that a new era of liberty, equality, and democracy was dawning. The American example seemed to many French intellectuals to be proof that republicanism was not only possible, but inevitable. The French Revolution was supposed to be a 1789. It was meant to be a bloodless coup in which the people of France would simply replace the old regime with a new constitutional government. The Americans had done it peacefully. Why couldn't the French do the same? The answer, of course, is that the French Revolution was much more complex than the American Revolution. For one thing, the French Revolution was fought between the people and the French monarchy, while the American Revolution was fought between the American colonies and the British monarchy. The French monarchy was deeply entrenched in the culture and politics of France, while the British monarchy was not. And since the French Revolution was fought between the people and the French monarchy, it was much more personal. The French people hated their king and their queen and their entire royal court. They had no qualms about executing them or any of their children. On the other hand, the American colonies didn't hate King George III. He was widely seen as a victim of his own ministers and parliament. And even after independence, many Americans still referred to themselves as loyalists. But perhaps the biggest difference between the two revolutions is that the American Revolution was primarily a war of independence, while the French Revolution was primarily a social and political revolution. The Americans wanted to be free from British rule and establish a new nation. The French, on the other hand, wanted to remake French society and politics. They wanted to abolish the feudal system and aristocratic privileges and create a more egalitarian and democratic France. This is why the French Revolution was so radical. It was not just a war for independence or a struggle between two rival powers. It was a fundamental reordering of French society. The French Revolution was about changing the way that people thought about government, society, and the role of the individual in politics. This is why the French Revolution continues to resonate today. It was not just a struggle for independence or a clash between two rival powers. It was a struggle for the very soul of France and for the future of democracy in Europe. As always, thank you so much for watching.